morning, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our Stanton Distinguished Leaders Series lecture with our guest, Chris McGrath of Mondelez International. Established by Dan and Mary Stanton, the parents of two McDonough alumni, the Stanton series connects our McDonough students and community with renowned executives who share stories about leadership in an ever-changing world. At Georgetown McDonough, we're committed to exploring how business can partner across industries to solve the world's most complex issues. Imagine what progress and innovations can come from collaborating on what we're calling the fields of the future: technology and the future of work, business and policy, the business of health, and today's very important and special topic, the business of sustainability. We are making great progress in this area, and we're delighted to host Chris McGrath to share her insights with us from her career and work in sustainability at Mondelez and the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. As Vice President and Chief of Global Impact, Sustainability, and Well-being, Chris leads a global agenda that includes sustainability, well-being, and community involvement for Mondelez International, one of the world's largest snacking companies, with brands including Oreo, Cadbury, which I grew up with, and Milka. After her successful track record building brands and developing new products, Chris brings her extensive innovation experience to challenges like deforestation, climate change, obesity, mindful snacking, and women's empowerment. In all of this work, Chris connects business growth and positive social impact. And that's what Georgetown McDonough also stands for. Chris created and is responsible for Cocoa Life, Mondelez International's signature sustainability program, which is investing over 400 million over 10 years in a holistic approach to lead the transformation of the cocoa supply chain through better farming practices, inclusive community empowerment, and forest conservation. Prior to her work at Mondelez, Chris worked at Kraft Foods for more than 20 years and has been named one of Fortune magazine's 50 most powerful Latinas in 2017 and again in 2018. Not only have her efforts been influential on a global scale, but her advice is helping us frame our own focus on business of sustainability here at Georgetown McDonough. Chris, thank you for all you do for us. We are also joined by Professor Vishal Agrawal, our Provost, distinguished Lapeyre Family Associate Professor, who is leading our initiative on the business of sustainability at Georgetown McDonough. Vishal's research focuses on sustainable operations, and he's the academic director of our MBA certificate on sustainable business, which we launched last year in partnership with our Business for Impact initiative, as well as a new Sustainable Business Fellows program for our undergraduate students. Vishal, thank you for moderating today's discussion. We look forward to it. Over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Paul. Chris, first, let me welcome you again to this series. We're so glad to have you and touch on these important topics that Paul just sort of referenced. We worked with Chris a couple of years ago on a variety of interesting topics and student projects. So I've already had firsthand experience of sort of the passion and the interesting excitement that Chris brings to this topic. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. And so with that, what I'll just set up is I have a few questions to sort of begin our discussion. We've also already received a bunch of questions from the attendees in advance, so I'll try to bring those in. And then we'll have some time at the end for some more Q&A based on the audience as well. So Chris, we would love to start by learning more about how you ended up working on sustainability. I know you have a marketing background, so it would be great to sort of hear about how you got to the point of sustainability and your interest and activities in it.
Sure, terrific. Thank you so much, Vishal, and thank you, Dean Almeida, for having me today. It's truly an honor to be part of this this series. So my journey into sustainability, as you heard from my bio, oh, could you try again? Sorry, that's my watch going off. Siri's trying to help me answer the question. Sorry. I was at Kraft Foods, and I was on my path to become a chief marketing officer. That was my ambition, and I had spent a long time on base brand management, and then I had a series of roles in innovation, and then had some real good progress in the multicultural space. And so then I was tapped to kind of take that and bring it to the next sort of emerging field, sustainability, and really try to bring, and I love sort of the opening around your focus as a school of bringing a business perspective and better connect sustainability with consumers and our brands. And that was right before our company split. So back in 2011, our company split and we became Mondelez International. It's the snack foods part of our business. So I went with it and am continuing to lead this area. And I think what, for me, we can talk more about it, but I think it's sort of what I love about the work, and the reason I've stayed with it is for two reasons. One, I feel like it's an area, an opportunity for really me to make a meaningful impact. I mean, I love marketing and I have a passion for it, but I feel like this work enables me to bring that skill set of, you know, innovation, sort of white space. I also started in finance, so the quant side of like, how do you bring all of that together to come up with new ways to tackle these really big systemic challenges that really also drive value for our business. So I love that. But importantly, I feel like for me, this is a way for me to help make a difference in the world in a way that, you know, as I think about my children and the future of, you know, the world and the people's lives that we're touching with our programs, it just feels like at this point in my life that it's just a even more meaningful part of, you know, a contribution that I can make.
Great. And in fact, my next question, and you've sort of already started hinting at that, was going to be, what is the overall approach to sustainability at Mondelez? That can be quite an important and challenging question for a lot of firms to think about how they approach it. And so I would love to sort of hear about that. And also perhaps about what are the stakeholders, about, as you said, one of them is obviously your customers that you're sort of responding to and thinking about as you start thinking about your sustainability strategies.
So we've always looked at, I would say, triangulating a variety of data sources and really being, I would say, our approach to sustainability being really linked to the business and business driven. And the data sources start with looking at our environmental footprint and understanding what the impact our business has end to end, from the areas where we source raw materials all the way to the end consumer. So our environmental footprint, we look at social risks, social assessment, and then we triangulate that with consumer research, where consumers, we look at regulators and governments and sort of what their concerns and issues are. We look often to, I think one of the things that's distinctive about our approach is being very humble, that we don't have all the answers. So talking with experts around what are the challenges and what do they, you know, think that areas we should be working on. So we work on all of that, and then focus on our sustainability strategy to formulated from all of that information. And I think what's distinctive about us is we've been very focused since the start. We look at the areas where we can really make a meaningful impact. I think the other thing that's distinctive is, again, that business mindset is really measuring the impact that we have with our program. So not just looking at, okay, what's the intervention and, you know, how many farmers are we training, or, you know, what's the outreach, but is it truly moving the needle? And that's tough to do, measure the impact. And so the other thing I would say is that just really being very collaborative. I loved, you know, this idea of, you know, looking at collaborations. We've already worked with you a couple of years ago, but that these are not challenges that any one company or entity can solve on their own. So partnerships are key.
Great. And in fact, sort of related to that, one of the increasingly important stakeholders who are sort of interested in what companies are doing are the shareholders, right? They sort of want to know about your sustainability performance and impact. How has Mondelez interaction been? I know you're doing some really interesting engagement with your shareholders around all of that. Could you talk a little bit about that as well?
Sure, it's been fascinating to see how the field has evolved and how rapidly it's changed for a variety of stakeholders, particularly for investors. So over the years, so since the start of our company, so Mondelez, we spun off from Kraft in 2012. So we are, and I've been leading this area since the start of the company. And so it used to be that occasionally we would have a socially responsible investor who wanted to talk with myself and folks on my team about what we're doing in sustainability, what are we doing in well-being, et cetera. And then it started to grow in terms of mainstream investors wanting to talk with us. Well, now we're at the point where we see the big investors like BlackRock and Larry Fink putting out what they think responsible companies need to be doing. And I think what's really exciting, I think, is that this has gone from being seen as sort of like an ethical issue and sort of the right thing to do, and are you a socially responsible company? I never liked that terminology because I always felt like this is about our business. This is not, a nice to do so we can have a CSR report. And I was like, please don't use the CSR terminology in our company because this is about driving growth in our business. And if we want to be able to have a business that's vital and resilient in the future, we need to be doing this work. So it's very much a business strategy. So I'm personally delighted that investors are very much seeing this as an integral part of business in terms of both managing risks and managing the upside opportunity. I think COVID has exacerbated that because I think now there's a much more broader understanding, particularly for mainstream consumers around the world, as we talk with consumers and monitor what the issues they're interested in. I think people understand the vulnerability that we have as humans to the environment that we're living in, and it's really important to make sure that we're taking good care of the environment because it is about our current health and our current well-being as well as the future.
Yeah. And that is, like Paul said, and as you mentioned, like how to sort of really think about the intersection of sustainability and the business case for it. That's been something which we've engaged a lot on, right? So I want to sort of start talking a little bit about a couple of areas of sustainability that Mondelez is really active in and taking leadership roles in. And these were also a lot of questions we got from our attendees. So I know that they're really interested in hearing about it. So the first topic I sort of want to get into is things that we've collaborated on student projects on in the past as well, is things related to climate change, especially related to crucial ingredients that you source and commodities. So tell us a little bit about all the activities. And I know there's a lot of interesting and cool stuff Mondelez is doing, but perhaps the interesting stuff that you're doing and leading in this area, and what your current goal and objectives are. How do you see that space?
Sure. So for us, as we do that work that I mentioned in terms of understanding what's material to us, climate change is our number one issue in terms of what the opportunity and need is for us to tackle. And when we look at our CO2 footprint, about 2/3 of it comes from the raw materials that we grow to make our products. So cocoa, wheat, palm oil, dairy are the principal ones where we see a big impact in terms of climate change. And so that's one reason that we have been very focused for the last few years. In addition, when we look at these supply chains, so cocoa has been a primary focus. So for us, we're one of the world's largest buyers of cocoa. So we can really make, and that's what I was saying earlier about, where can we make a meaningful difference and impact? And so when I first got started in this field, I went to Ghana at that time with the Cadbury team and started to see a pilot program they had going on in villages in Ghana. And that was the beginning of my journey. And I came from marketing, and for folks in your business school who are, MBAs in marketing and thinking about brands, there was a very distant relationship that I had, and I think many of our marketers did at that time, from the supply chain. And so one of the things that I did is, once I understood the complexity of the challenges that we were facing, that climate change comes from deforestation. Deforestation is related to the way the crop is grown. For perspective, about 70% of the world's cocoa is grown in 2 small countries in West Africa by mainly smallholder farmers who have small plots of land, and they don't have good access to agricultural inputs and financing to be able to have more productive farms. And so that then leads to more deforestation because they're cutting down more land to try to have low yielding farms. And then that leads to issues of poverty. There's lack of infrastructure in the country to help them have good access to schools, roads, electricity, just, and so it's a vicious cycle. So we created, so that work that I was doing led to the creation of Cocoa Life. For us, Cocoa Life is, and I think this is really important for sustainability, is to tackle the root causes of the issues. And that's just the very definition, right, of like sustainable solutions is ones where if you don't tackle the root causes, then you're not going to see real change happen over time. So for us, Cocoa Life it is our signature sustainability program. It is for a $400 million investment over a 10-year time frame. We're in year 8 right now. We work in 6 different origins around the world. So Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, Brazil, Dominican Republic, India, as well as Indonesia. And one of the things that we're able to do is tailor the program to the needs of the different origins, and they vary slightly. And I would say the other thing is it's a holistic, integrated solution. So it's working with farmers on their productivity and their regenerative agriculture, agroforestry, all the good things you need to do for the environment, combined with community interventions and really helping the communities learn how to plan for their futures, work together collaboratively, advocate for themselves with government, and be able to have, I would say, work towards the better infrastructure that then, leads to better communities, better social outcomes. So, and doing that in an integrated way is what we're tackling. We have other programs on wheat, such as Harmony, where we're doing, it's a little bit different. Harmony's grown. That's a program that we started in France with wheat farmers in Europe. So very different situations. Sometimes you see some of the commonalities, certainly figuring out how to use the land better for future generations, using less fertilizer. We are one of the things that we've done. We're almost at 100% of our wheat for Europe being sourced through the Harmony program. And so we've worked on using like 20% less pesticide, the farmers there, which is good for the environment. It's good for the farmers, for their own economics. So it's a win-win. So it's those kinds of solutions, but tailoring it to what the need is of the crop, the commodity, and what the needs are of the growers is really important to, again, be a sustainable solution.
And I should add, like, I'm an operations and supply chain person, and we were fortunate enough with our projects with Mondelez to actually visit Ghana and see the whole cocoa supply chain and really understand the complexity. And something that was very interesting to me, and you sort of touched on it, and I hope perhaps you can elaborate, was the intersection between the environmental and sustainability challenges along with the social root causes or social inclusion things, for example, like women's economic empowerment or other things. So could you sort of elaborate more? Because I thought that was, at least to me, very fascinating and an interesting, not just challenge, but also an opportunity to do good in terms of working at that intersection.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So women, again, as you start to uncover, okay, so if we want to improve the productivity of the crop and you understand you start digging into who's growing it, women in both Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire tend to have a bigger role on the farm, in the family farms and on their farms. And yet they have very little access to training because the cultural traditions are that, men are in the co-ops, the farming cooperatives, men come to the meetings, men get the training, because that's what, the gender sort of stereotypes are, that, men are the ones that represent the various entities. So one of the things that we've done through the Cocoa Life program is to work with the communities. You have to do it in a culturally sensitive way. So engaging the chiefs, engaging the community elders to make sure that folks understand, why would we want to talk to women? Why would we want to include women in the training? Because women are doing a good bulk of the work, and women are doing, importantly, when you get into it, they're doing work that really changes the productivity of the cocoa trees. They're doing the prunings of the tree. They're doing often the fertilizing of the tree, and they take care of the seedlings in the nurseries. the young cocoa plant. So all of those really have a sort of exponential, impact on the productivity. So really important to get to them. And then it's important to make sure once you get everybody's alignment that, boy, we should be talking with women and training them, et cetera, and including them and having a voice and a say in the cocoa business. Then once you do all that, then you have to make sure you can have a training class that is at a time and a location that works for women, because they have a lot of other responsibilities, particularly in these rural communities with their families, et cetera. So we started doing that. And then we started doing, women training the trainer, so that, again, just being very sensitive to some of the local dynamics around, how can we help sort of women be change agents and in bringing other women around. And then that has also led simultaneously to more financial inclusion and financial tools. So village savings and loan associations, where we have tens of thousands of women now and community members involved, and 70% of them are women. And that gives women the ability to be able to have their own source of income, ability to save, ability to pool money together. And then that gives them more confidence and more voice. So to your point of economic and social, it's part of the systemic change and some of the interrelationships that are important. And of course, done in a culturally sensitive way, because this isn't about men versus women. This is about the community growing together to be more vibrant and stronger together. And we work with local NGO partners, because you can imagine what's a big snack company know about coming from the US or Europe, know about what's going on in Western Africa. So doing it with local NGOs, and that also then helps to build the local capacity, which again is really important for sustainable solutions.
Yeah, that's been my go-to example ever since that experience a couple of years ago, to sort of illustrate how all those dynamics play a role. The other thing which we sort of you touched on in your answer, and I think I really want to highlight this, is what had been interesting to me to look at Mondelez's sustainability efforts was a lot of companies might just sort of say, well, we're going to do fair trade certification, and that's our sustainability program to source this ingredient. Mondelez's approach is sort of different, right? You have this holistic Cocoa Life program, which is obviously can be risky, but also comes with so much opportunities, like your answer has already sort of described. Could you talk a little bit more about your approach at Mondelez on sort of developing your own capabilities and your own programs, which are tailored to specific communities, versus sort of the other approach of certifications and things like that, or even complementing them, if that makes sort of sense?
Sure, absolutely. We didn't start on a journey that said, as I mentioned to you, when I started Vishal on this journey, with a lot of innovation background, right? So I just approached it as I would any innovation project, like white space, like, okay, let's understand the problem and the potential solutions, and how do we tackle the challenge. And so started from there, and just started talking with, at that point, when I first got into this, we were buying both Rainforest Alliance and Fair Trade Cocoa, and just started understanding sort of what their interventions were, and doing our own assessment of what was going on the ground. And we just felt that we wanted the ability to be able to have a program that, that what had the intersection exactly of what we're talking about, of environmental and social, and none of the options at that point that were available delivered against that. The other thing too is that, I think for us, it was really a significant shift to go from being sort of arm's distance, when you're buying certified products, it's great, what the standards are, they show you data, et cetera, but it is an arm's length transaction. You're really buying those ingredients and entrusting other groups to do it. And we felt that, we really wanted to get in and understand, and again, business approach. We want to be able to hold our suppliers, hold the NGOs accountable. And we have within each of the origins, so we have teams on the ground. So we have our own folks there who are working hand in hand with these various partners, and who have quarterly meetings to talk about, okay, we said we were going to, do this round of programming. How's it going? What are the results? What's the data? So that, it's not that we're just writing checks and just giving money away or buying ingredients. And part of that is, again, because we want to see what's working so that we can accelerate what is, address what isn't, and also be able to tailor the programs much more to the needs of, even within Ghana. There's different levels of farmers in terms of skill sets and development in terms of the communities. And so it's not a one size fits all approach. So we just felt like, again, we're trying to make sure that the amount of investment that's needed to truly change is massive. And so it's really important that we get in there and spend. It sounds like a lot of money, but it's a lot of money's needed. And so we really, to get that return on investment, need to be really choiceful about how we spend and invest the money.
Great. Also, so shifting gear to another aspect, which is quite important in discussions today, but also a lot of our attendees want to hear about, is related to packaging. It's become quite important and a lot of attention. And I know over the last couple of years, just me following it, Mondelez has really established itself as a leader in sort of sustainability around packaging. Could you share with us more about what are you doing in the packaging space? What are the different directions you're pursuing and so forth?
Absolutely. So as you said, packaging is an area that we've always worked on since the beginning of the company, but the breadth and scope of what we're doing and our ambition continues to grow because the issues are just continuing to grow in importance and our understanding of it. So we've always had a strategy to use less, and that makes just a ton of sense, obviously. So if you use less, then there's just less going into the environment. So since 2012, we've taken out 65,000 tons of packaging. That was our goal to achieve by last year, and we did that. But we also issued a goal probably about a year and a half ago, put it out into the public domain, that we wanted to get all of our packaging to be 100% recycle ready. And we're making great progress against that. We're at 94% today. Of our packaging, and we will achieve the 100% by 2025. And we've been working deeply in the organization across our 14 business units with our R&D folks to understand, what it will take to get that done. But I would tell you that that's just really the beginning of the challenge and the need, because for us, what we look at is what is the actual recycling in practice that's happening in the world. And one of the biggest challenges is that there's just not the infrastructure that exists in the world today to collect packaging garbage, and to be able to collect it properly and recycle it just is really just not. It's kind of amazing sometimes when you think about sort of these systemic challenges, right? That we could live in a world where the systems are so sort of primitive almost, but that's the world that we live in, and particularly for flexible plastics. So, PET bottles, I would say that the beverage companies and the health and beauty care have been just working on that. They've been using plastic a little bit longer, and so therefore they've been out in front a little bit longer in terms of being able to set up systems. When you think about a recycling system, there's value in those PET bottles. So there's, they were able to collect them and process them. Flexible films, so about 20% of our portfolio today, of our packaging portfolio, is in flexible films. The rest is in cardboard or paper, etc. And so those flexible films, they go through a recycling center and they get all churned up, or recycling. And if you think about it all winds up being sludge. And so what we're working on now is chemical recycling, to be able to take that that film and be able to process it in a way that gets then put back into the packaging system. And part of the sensitivity there is we need stuff that is safe from a food contact perspective. And so being able to have it be able to come back into food contact is quite challenging, but we're making good progress. We have a goal that by 2025, we'll have 5% of recycled content. It's starting to hit the market on our Philly cream cheese tubs in Europe next year. So, and the other thing I would say that's super important in all of this is, we're not in the business, no other, CPG company is in the business of building recycling infrastructure or chemical recycling plants, as you can imagine. So it's about joining in coalitions, working with governments, working with suppliers, again, to tackle and build good collection systems, recycling systems, et cetera. So we were like really deeply involved and pushing on the fully integrated end-to-end approach of what's needed. So taking care of our own portfolio and then working on proving out some of these technologies.
Great. And in fact, one of the questions we got from our audience was whether Mondelez would see itself in the future moving to durable or reusable packaging. And I would imagine that especially for things like flexible film, that would be quite infeasible or difficult, and especially with food contact stuff. But are there any of your packaging streams where you sort of are exploring that as an option, or it just doesn't fit the application?
Yeah, it's a great question. I saw it as well. And this is part of the challenge is and as with sustainability, so often there's sort of multiple agendas. So for us, it's about, making sure that we have food safety. When we look at the environmental impact, actually our packaging, all of our packaging only contributes 5% of our CO2 because it's really, really efficient at keeping our food fresh and keeping it safe. So the plastic, it's serving a really good role there from a climate perspective, but of course we don't want it to wind up, polluting the environment, hence the need for the infrastructure. So we're balancing those agendas. And we have a project in Europe today where we've been working with some of our Milka products to have them in, there's a coalition called Loop, and it's basically trying different reusable containers. So we have one in France on Milka, but it's challenging because it's not, because frankly, from a food safety perspective, you still need that chocolate when it goes into the reusable container or that biscuit or whatever to be in some kind of package to keep it from having contact. And so, and if you put it in paper, then, people ask me, well, why don't you just convert everything to paper? Well, for two reasons. A, the shelf life is less, the food, and so therefore we wind up from an environmental footprint having more food waste, which is bad from a CO2 perspective. And we also then wind up starting to have to use a lot more paper, which leads to deforestation challenges, and it just pulls on a different part of the supply chain. It's not an excuse; it's just part of the challenge of the competing things that we're working on.
Yeah, and I was going to make that point, but you already did that so well. But especially with food, packaging has this sort of interesting trade-off where you need the packaging to avoid food waste, which obviously leads to carbon emissions. Yeah. So the other thing I sort of wanted to talk a little bit about, and you've already touched on this, is sort of a bunch of recent developments in the last couple of years. So one related to COVID, there's been a lot of discussions whether COVID and associated impacts would make companies focus more on sustainability or retreat from sustainability. Whenever somebody asks me this, my reaction has been that to me it would make sense to sort of dig in because it just has sort of highlighted how important everything is. You sort of touched on that as well. But let me perhaps ask you, are there any changes that you've seen or modifications to your sustainability strategies given everything that's been going around in the last couple of years, or has just sort of renewed your focus?
I would say for us, what I'm delighted about, it's completely affirmed and we've accelerated during this time frame, both in terms of the focus, the importance, et cetera. We have strong engagement from our CEO. I meet with him quarterly. I meet with his staff and he's just personally interested. Last year, he hosted the first time that we ever had a direct investor presentation focused on sustainability. So of course, there's always the quarterly earnings conversations with our investors about earnings, but this was one dedicated to sustainability. We'll do it again this year. So our board is very interested. They want to know what's going on. When I think I might have touched on, I'm personally having the conversations with all of our top investors. When we set up meetings to talk about issues within the company. They want to also talk about sustainability. And so I'm there with some of our board of directors, et cetera. So there's just a very strong interest. And I think part of it is just understanding not just the risks and opportunities, but really truly understanding that this is part of your business resiliency. And, we've gotten through the COVID crisis quite well as a company for a number of good things. Keeping our workers safe in the factories to keep our lines running and taking extensive steps to do that, doing a lot of community support. We gave almost $30 million of contribution last year to communities around the world through donations and in-kind products. So, but having the resilience to be able to keep our supply chain going, to keep all of that going, and understanding, just again, I think for consumers, that connection between, what's going on in my world around me really does have an impact potentially on my well-being, because I think everyone is pretty much aware that the likelihood is that this disease started with, coming from the interaction of nature with humans in passing the disease along.
Great. Another timely sort of topic and discussion is around diversity and inclusion. I know Mondelez has taken a powerful stance and being active and purposeful in this space. And I know that you've been one of the leaders in different efforts over the years on the company's diversity and inclusion programs. Could you share a little bit more about that and both Mondelez as well as your approach to these topics?
Sure. So we have been working for the last few years really focused on women in particular, women having greater representation and in the leadership levels. We have good gender balance in sort of entry level and mid-level management, and then we start to see women drop off. And so I've personally been involved on our Diversity and Inclusion Council. We've had internal conferences, speaking events, and mentorship programs, all with a dedicated focus, and we're seeing improvement in those results. Last year, with everything that happened in the US with George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, we put additional focus on people of color representation, and we put commitments out around that. I'm really proud, and we're in the midst of doing the work, and I'm really proud of the commitment of our CEO and our management team of really having honest, open conversations around, what are the barriers and the challenges, et cetera. So we've appointed now a Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer who is reporting directly to our head of HR and into the CEO, and with rolling out various types of awareness building programs. We also have a commitment to double the Black representation of management by 2024, as well as to spend $1 billion with minority and women-owned businesses globally by 2024. So a number of tangible things that we can measure, and we're not stopping there. I guess the last thing I would say is what is exciting and I'm personally involved with is a sort of ground up. What do we need to do to make sure that we're valuing and giving everybody the opportunity to sort of bring their best selves and be themselves, whatever their orientation is, to be able to truly get the value of diversity, right? Which is that you sort of get the best of everyone, all of your talent and everybody's contributions. And so we've got programs that we're working on. My function today is in corporate and legal affairs. And so we're working on internship programs and mentoring programs and different things that we're doing to make that cultural reality happen.
Great. And in fact, so I'll open it up to some questions from our audience. So one thing I was going to ask is, I know another part of your job is thinking about consumer well-being. So how is Mondelez sort of focusing in that, especially better for you food and space, that sort of aspect of your efforts?
Yeah. So for us, well-being, one of the things that we see is that it's this balance between indulgent and well-being products within snacking, within the snack world, and what we see that the dollar growth of indulgence snacks is stronger or bigger than but when you look at the well-being portfolio as a percentage basis, it's growing faster. So this is one of those areas where we want to do both. And part of what we've been working on for a number of years now is just understanding being very consumer centric in our well-being work, to understand two things. One, the challenge consumers have. They absolutely love to snack. Snacking behavior is up around the world, particularly with folks being home during the pandemic. And there's a lot of benefits that people find in snacking: nutritional, energy boosts, emotional needs. So one of the things we've worked on for a long time, I personally have worked on, is mindful snacking. And it's this ability to help consumers really be focused on getting maximum pleasure and satisfaction when they are snacking versus not paying attention. I don't know if it's ever happened to you, Vishal, but maybe you're eating a bag of something and you're not paying attention, watching something, or
All the time.
and then it's like, oh my goodness, I can't believe I ate all that. Where did it go? So we've got some real practical, easy things, and there's a lot of science. I've personally been working on this platform for 7 years. There's a lot of science that we've gathered and published and shared publicly with different consumer health folks to make it easy for them to bring these behaviors to consumers. And now more of our brands are starting to activate. So that's one thing that we're doing. The other thing we're doing is on our products themselves. So looking at how can we continue to enhance the well-being credentials. We just launched like Oreo gluten-free in the US. We have lower sugar formulations on Cadbury that we've done in like the UK and India. So just continuing to look at how do we improve our portfolio, and then how do we get into well-being adjacencies. And I don't know if you noticed, we just earlier this year announced the purchase of Hue Chocolate in the US, which is a paleo-friendly vegan line of chocolates. I love them. That's not a plug. It's a great line, So how can we continue? We have our Snack Futures Hub, which is our innovation sort of incubator, working on well-being, and well-being is a big focus there, looking at like plant-based snacks and looking at, how do we use like upcycle ingredients that might be otherwise, go to food waste, etc. So just a variety of ways for us to, again, grow with consumers and address the well-being needs that they have that are continuing to evolve.
Yeah, very interesting. I also want to make sure we have a lot of students who are attending, as well as some alumni, and they have a bunch of interesting questions. I want to make sure that I get those to you as well. So one, which I think is obviously also close to my heart, what role do you think education about sustainability, especially for students, plays in the overall efforts or initiatives in improving sustainability in sort of your perspective?
Well, what I think is exciting is that, when I went to Kellogg Northwestern for my MBA, different school, but, and I was focused on marketing, and I don't even think there was a class on sustainability at that time. Or it was much more, not meaning as part of the business school, it was, or maybe it was one elective, but it wasn't I don't think that folks, in business school were really, again, thinking about this intersection, right? And, as Paul said, it's about the business of sustainability. So I think now it's part of, it sounds like for your school and as I talk with others, becoming much more part of the curriculum and understanding what are the issues what are the opportunities. If you're going to be a business manager, I think it's just something that you need to be aware of. It's kind of like, I think design thinking for a while was kind of sort of the hot thing. And, again, growing up in the innovation space, I just think about, to me, it's another lens, right? Just like design, where it's like, okay, so how to be sort of, I would say, not just consumer centric in our business, in our product and business, and as we think about it, but how do you be sort of globally and world centric, right? And so sustainability is something that touches. I just was on a panel this morning getting ready, not a panel, but a task force that I'm on, getting ready for the climate summit on food systems and what do we need to do to work with governments and multi-stakeholders to work on changing food systems. And so this idea of collaborations, that no one sector has the answer. So if you're going to be a business person in the future, I think increasingly understanding that it's not just a matter of like, I'm going to, do my business or service and sell it and everything's going to be good. It's really kind of being much more of a citizen of the world. And that's one thing I love about what you do at Georgetown, is because I feel like you that's the perspective that you have.
Yeah, and I think, a lot of times discussion of sustainability tends to be about the risks and the costs and so forth. And I think what you're touching on is the role of innovation. And to me, sustainability is almost like innovating not at the product level itself, but on the system level, on the supply chain level, right? Just on a bigger scale. And in fact, some of our students have questions sort of related to that. So for example, a question we have is, if you're a student looking to sort of get into the food sustainability or the food space, what should they be focusing on while at school to prepare for a career? And sort of related to that, folks asked what skills, if you look back on your career, you think you wish you would have known sooner or was the most useful to you. And especially folks also wanted to know what skills from your, I think we already touched on this, from marketing that you use in sustainability.
So I think if you're interested in sustainability, I would say, again, to the extent that there are classes offered as part of a business curriculum, but I think also making sure that you take the classes in finance, in supply chain, understanding supply chains, and understanding, like you're saying, if there's a systems thinking class, change management, because so much of this is about being able to think through how do you frame up the challenge. And this is drawing on my own experience. I was an accounting and philosophy double major at BC, another wonderful Jesuit school, and I have my MBA in marketing. So I started in finance. I spent most of my career in marketing and new product innovation. And one of the things that I find most helpful, that I draw on the most, is sort of that right brain, left brain. And what I mean by that is I feel like in my role, I need to be able to understand what the challenges are, right? And how does that relate to our business? And what's the solution that then that I can quantify and understand what's the business impact, top line opportunity, bottom line. One of the things we've been working on is trying to calculate return on sustainable investment, right? So really bringing a business lens, but importantly, being able to, I think if you're going to be in this space, the reason I mentioned some of those disciplines is I think you have to be able to be a translator to figure out, again, what's the challenge, come up with solutions, and I'm not the technical, with my marketing background in the background. I mean, I'm not the technical person. We have fabulous technical folks within our company who understand, packaging engineering and the materials and how does chemical recycling work and all of that, right? And how do you make something with less sugar taste fabulous? So we have all of that expertise. My job is more of a general manager to be able to think through how do I connect the various disciplines and be able to talk to management and our investors in a way that they can understand some of these more technical topics.
Great. We also have a couple of questions sort of touching on the aspect of the organizational structure and decision making and sustainability. So for example, the question we have is, how do you navigate allocating sustainability work in general or growing and adapting your strategies between internal hires versus external consultants? How is sort of the sustainability function, if you will, structured?
Yeah. It's a great question. So within our company, and I think this is true as I talk with some of my peers, it's a multi-function discipline. So again, my job is to lead the sustainability strategy and implementation to make sure it's embedded in the business. And I kind of think of myself as like an orchestra leader where, it touches almost every functional part of our business. And so being able to make sure that folks understand what it is we're trying to achieve, that are aligned to the goals, and that we are all sort of driving it together and measuring our performance. So with that, we have cross-functional teams that are working on the projects together. I've folks on my team help to lead some of those teams. Some of them are led by other cross-functional leaders in the company. So collaboration's key. And then it's a balance of, I think, we're a fairly small, lean team, which I think is okay. I think that's a good thing because, again, I think it helps to ensure you're super focused and that we are pulling from the right, good cross-functional collaboration with some expertise on the outside. So we're very quick to say, what do we know? What do we need? And who are the right partners to bring on board to help us on very specific things, that it's just better to work with, if it's somebody who understands carbon accounting or how do you measure your, environmental impact, and making sure that, we tap into that expertise versus trying to grow it ourselves.
Great. And sort of related to that, and something that has kept coming up is A lot of things that Mondelez does is sort of, you take the leadership on it, you focus on it on your own, versus there's a lot of other things where you work on with different types of coalitions of different industries, different companies. Could you talk a little bit more about that? How do you decide what you're going to sort of collaborate on, and what do you sort of decide to focus on? And especially maybe the benefits and the opportunities you've seen in working with collaborations and coalitions.
Sure. So I would say that, we're really clear on what the issues are that we are grappling with. Deforestation, climate change, poverty, livelihoods for smallholder farmers, and also plastics, as we talked about, and packaging. So and then human rights and social inclusion. So we have within our strategy, we have 4 pillars. And so when we look at like the issues, we're involved in industry groups. So I personally am co-chairing within the Consumer Goods Forum, which is the top CPG manufacturers and retailers around the world. I'm co-chairing the Forest Positive Coalition. We're working on deforestation, and I have a retail co-chair who's from Carrefour, and so we're working with a handful of companies who are really active. It's gone from being, and I think that this is something that we've seen in our industry. We've all been working on something like deforestation for the last 10 years with some progress, but I would say, we're not satisfied with where we are. So we've gotten basically with the support of our CEOs to say, okay, who's up for really investing and really driving change, and because it doesn't fit every company's agenda. So going from being like a trade industry where everybody signs on to really being much more a coalition of the willing and coalitions of action. And so we have that on human rights. We're involved in that one. We have that on packaging, et cetera. That's something that we're doing in the Consumer Goods Forum. And I think it's a really significant shift in the way, again, industry, our company and other companies like ours are continuing to push forward for real change. World Cocoa Foundation, I've been on the board. That's, again, the top chocolate and cocoa companies and suppliers, and working together. We've been working together for several years now, and I get a similar approach of coalitions. And we always have an antitrust lawyer in all of these meetings. So it's very much understanding, we understand, like, we're talking about pre-competitive space, working on some of the issues I mentioned in terms of agroforestry and working with farmers and on livelihoods and environment. That's not where we're going to win market share. I mean, you know what I mean? So we're very careful about making sure we don't get into competitive issues and having the right precautions, of course. But these are solutions that I think all of us recognize that no one company can do it alone.
Right. Looking at the time, Chris, I'll take this opportunity to thank you again so much for this very interesting and fascinating conversation on such an important topic. I'm sure, at least just for me, and I'm sure for a lot of attendees, they've given us a lot to think about and read about and look into and be optimistic about where we're going. So I'll thank you again for being here. And with that, we'll end the webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course, our pleasure.
Yep.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.